part of this distinguished series. I'm also very grateful to the College of Physical and Mathematical Sciences for bringing me in to talk about these things. And also, I'd like to thank the Maxwell Institute for publishing this book upon which this lecture is actually built. This came out due to their encouragement, their faith in my take on evolution and science, and actually the genesis was from members of the Maxwell Institute that brought this about. And so I'm grateful to them, and I'm grateful to you for being here. I am so encouraged to see so many people interested in evolution and faith. It's my favorite subject, and I could talk about it all day. They told me I'm going to have to quit at 1 a.m. Does that sound right? Okay. No, they told me to end it in an hour, so I'll do my best. I'd like to leave some time for questions and answers. I want to start off with kind of an interesting event. Samuel Wilberforce was a fiery Anglican preacher, and in June 30th, 1860, he and the person we call Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, had a vigorous debate about evolution and his new book, Origin of Species. A lot of times, and this is where the famous event, there's a famous quip that happens. At one point, Bishop Wilberforce turns to Thomas Huxley and says, was it through your mother or your father that you inherited your monkey origins? And Huxley quips back, better a monkey than a bishop who squanders his talents in obscuring the truth. The interesting thing was, though, this wasn't really as much a debate about religion as it was about science. Huxley was, or rather Wilberforce was not someone who was just fighting religion against science. He was interested in the scientific aspects as well. But another event occurred there that I think did set the stage for this conflict between religion and science that continues to this day, and which I'll argue tonight is completely unnecessary. There was an old man sitting in the back of this exchange, this debate, and he stood up and he held a Bible over his head, and he said, "Believe in God rather than man." And he said that the origin had given him the acutest pain. This is a picture. I bet you don't recognize him, but you'll recognize his name. And it turns out that this man was, in fact, Robert Fitzroy, the captain of the HMS Beagle, the ship that Darwin sailed on and formulated his early thinking on evolution. And he did see fear. He had become, since the voyage, a biblical literalist. And he took everything the Bible said as a literal fact. And as he gets older and older, he becomes a stranger and more bitter old fellow. He was a member of the Royal Society, but he disavowed strongly everything that Darwin had written and talked about. This may be a better mark for the conflict between religion and science than Wilberforce, because Fitzroy saw everything in terms of black and white literalism. I love science, I really do. I love everything about it. The things that it's revealed about the world. This is an ant milking aphids. Taps their abdomen with its antennae, and they squirt a little bit of mildew out, and the ants drink it. They're actually sort of ant ranchers. This is like the ant dairy farm, because they'll move their aphids. Once they wear out a plant, they'll move it to another plant. So they do this like cattle drive of aphids, and I've always wondered what songs they sang on the trail, as get along, little doggies kind of thing, as they went their way. But I want to tell you my personal story, because my personal story is one of being in love with science and evolution and finding myself troubled by the split, eventually siding against evolution, and then citing back to evolution. And I think it becomes, my experience is probably not untypical, except I was able to come back to evolution. I want to talk a little bit about that. Just to be really clear, this came out in this month's New Era, interestingly, just in time for my talk. It's the question and answer, what does the church believe about evolution? The church has no official position on the theory of evolution. Organic evolution or changes to species' inherited traits over time is a matter for scientific study. Absolutely. Nothing has been revealed concerning evolution. This isn't quite the perspective that many of you grew up with, and I dare say there's probably a few people who would disagree with this assessment, but this is coming out of the New Era, so you are forced to believe it. Just kidding. So my early history with evolution starts as a 5-year-old when I got the Prehistoric Times playset, and this was massive. It had about 500 plastic dinosaurs. I was in love with this. And those of you with good eyes can tell that I'm flying a caveman around with my Christmas tree. What else would you do with a Christmas tree and a caveman? In fact, at that age, I had written down what I wanted to be when I grew up was a caveman. I wasn't quite aware of employment opportunities. They've since repurposed that job. Here I am at Vernal looking at dinosaur museums, and as a 7-year-old still holding on to a bat and a pterodactyl. And you have to ask, what else does a 7-year-old need but a bat and a pterodactyl? I mean, that completes you when you're 7. And so I loved dinosaurs. I loved the history of the earth. I loved studying about it. If you go back to my pictures from about 7th to 10th grade, I'm drawing dinosaurs with palm trees and volcanoes going off in the background. That was my favorite thing in the entire world. Time went on. I became active in the church, and I went on a mission to Arkansas. And let me tell you about a reversal to that 7-year-old kid enamored with dinosaurs. I remember very specifically arguing with an investigator and trying to convince him that he needed to give up evolution if he was going to be baptized. That's how firmly I was convinced that evolution and the gospel were completely incompatible. In fact, I had read this in Man, His Origin and Destiny. This is from Joseph Fielding Smith. And he says, this brings us to the discussion of what I believe to be the most pernicious doctrine ever entering the mind of man. Notice the superlatives here, most pernicious. The theory that man evolved from lower forms of life. For its source, we must go beyond the activities and research of mortal man to the author of evil, who has been an enemy of truth from the beginning, before the earth was formed. And who was that author of evil? None other than Satan. And this was my perspective, that Satan himself was behind the theory of evolution. Darwin and Kish Kuman were of the same sort of spirit. David O. McKay said that this book never should have been published. This book, if we had time, I'd go into the history, but it was written in response to a book by B.H. Roberts, who did believe in pre-Adamites. But I won't go far in this. But it was a book that should have never been written. I tend to agree with that. And I got to BYU, and one of my first acts, I am still interested in evolution. I've become sort of the anti-person of what I was. I didn't believe in it anymore. I, in fact, argued that perspective was right. And I got to BYU, and one of my first acts, I got off my mission in November, was back at BYU. I was buying my books, and I said, I'm going to see what they're using in the evolution class. I knew they taught one. So I went to the bookstore, and I was actually going to buy it because it would, at BYU, you knew that the evolutionary textbook would dismantle this horrific idea. And I got it out, and it didn't do that. It was just a regular textbook like you'd find at the University of Utah. I mean, it was mind-boggling. And I even looked around. I thought maybe underneath, the refutation was so compelling. Maybe everybody had bought it, but there was nothing on the list. And I started taking biology classes. I wanted to find out what was going on. And at the same time, 2 TV programs were on that began to influence the way that I thought tremendously. David Attenborough's Life on Earth and Carl Sagan's Cosmos became a regular Sunday night activity for me and my friends. And as the story of evolution began to unfold, as I began to sense the great power and beauty of the theory, I began to think, there is something to this. And my little 5-year-old mind started to reemerge, and I began to think, yeah, this is the real deal. I'm so grateful I was at BYU, because being presented with the power of the evolutionary story, if I'd been anywhere else, I might have gotten lost. And that's happening today a lot. There is a lot of people getting lost because they are convinced, they've been taught this through well-meaning teachers in the church and others who have painted a picture that the 2 ideas are incompatible. If you really believe that, when you're confronted with evolution, it becomes a greatly difficult thing not to say, if I have to choose between one or the other, maybe I'll choose the one that's right here in front of me so beautifully and the evidence so compelling. People have made that choice. Friends have made that choice. And it makes me sad because they never should have been set up to have to make that choice. But luckily I was at BYU and I had mentors there. These are 2, Dwayne Jeffries and Clayton White were zoology professors that I had that literally changed my life because they made it okay to believe in evolution and be an active and believing Mormon. They're in the audience right now. I am so grateful that they're here tonight so that I can put up their pictures and let them know how amazing the influence they have been on my life, because they did make it possible. And in fact, even though I was wandering around in mathematics, I was always interested in evolution. And in fact, my dissertation was published in the journal Evolution. That was my aim and goal. I just thought if it didn't work out, at least I could get a really good job if I majored in statistics and math. So it was my backup plan. But I got into evolution, so I was very happy. I came here to do what they did, to be a force for good, to let people know that believing in evolution and religion are okay. And in fact, they are not only just okay, they fit together well, and especially Mormons. I think there is no other theology that lends itself to evolutionary thinking on the planet. And I'll give you some of the reasons for that. But I moved here. I was a research scientist with the Agriculture Research Service, and I got my job at BYU. We moved from the big island of Hawaii to BYU in 25-degree weather in a snowstorm. And believe me, everybody in my family was asking, what are you doing here? We still ask that question. Have you ever had an experience at a state conference or somewhere where you feel like one of the speakers is talking directly to you? You think, man, that message was for me. Well, Elder Nelson came and gave a talk at our state conference, and this is what he said. He said, to you scientists in the room, and I look around, and I'm convinced I was probably the only scientist in the room. I don't know, but I think I was. I've never known any different in my stake. A few have moved in and out, but at that time, I'm pretty sure I was the only scientist. So Elder Nelson is talking to me, and it felt like that. I took it like that. I felt a call and a mandate at that moment. He said, to you scientists in the audience, go back to foundations. Find the root and basis of your science. And I was really interested in philosophy. I took lots of philosophy classes when I was at BYU from David Paulson and Jim Faulkner, and they were other influences. And at another talk, I'll talk about how they changed my life. But I took this as a mandate. I took this as something that I was called to do, was to go back and play in philosophy. And I did. It took a lot of work to master a new discipline, but after about 5 years of reading, studying, I began to publish in this arena, mostly in the area, as was mentioned, in understanding how computers are used in science, especially as modeling devices in simulation. It's a really interesting and intriguing question. But I started a blog called The Mormon Organon back in 2008, named after Aristotle's great work, The Organon. And I was interested in looking at science and faith, and I was completely baffled by the vehemence of the attacks that I received. I was genuinely shocked. In fact, I've got to read this because it's my favorite. This was from another person's faith and science blog, except it was kind of the anti-version of mine. They said, "It seems BYU biology department needs a little course correction. The biology department's mandate is to teach the science of biology, including evolution, with the light of the gospel. And I'm sure they're doing an excellent job of teaching the principles of biology and evolution, but when it comes to integrating the principles of biology with the principles of the gospel, they've goofed. They're way off course. That's right, if they were NASA, the Mars rover would have crash landed on Venus." Which actually would have been an achievement. It's hard to hit anything in space. Can someone please tell me how a godless and directionless theory of descent of mankind is in harmony with the purpose-driven and divinely directed theology of creation? BYU biology professors who do not recognize these inconsistencies between the evolutionary and gospel accounts of the creation of mankind need to do some reading. That's actually a really safe statement, because biology professors and professors of mankind really do need to do some reading. Part of the job. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that we solve this problem? What exactly is at stake? You'll recognize the three people there. They're called the Evangelical Three. There's three evangelical atheists. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. I read them all regularly because they challenge me. Well, actually, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris don't understand religion very well, so they're not as fun to read. Their version of religion pretty much would only be recognized by someone that handles snakes in Appalachia. No offense to snake handlers from Appalachia, by the way. I'm just saying. Daniel Dennett, though, he's a marvelous writer. He's a keen mind. He understands religion, and I love reading him. He challenges me and makes me think. You'll notice that all the really good seasons of Star Trek, they had a good enemy. You know, if it was like the Ferengi, it was a wimpy season. But if it was the Borg, it was fantastic. Having somebody to go head-to-heads with is a lot of fun. What's at stake, I think, are people in the same place I was, the youth of our church, others in the church, lots of people who hear... I'm not sure how to work my laser. Oop, that's not it. Yeah, doesn't matter. They're reading the Book of Mormon. And are confronted with the wonders of faith. Faith teaches me things that I learn in no other way. And it's been an important and consistent part of my life. But also, these same youth are studying science. They're learning the wonders of science, the absolute compelling nature of the beauties that science discovers. And when we put this into terms of conflict, and we set it up that these are at war and that they have to choose. I don't know how many times I've been told that. You have to choose a side. You have to either, you're on the Lord's side or on the side of godless science. I think it's a false dichotomy, and I think it's a dangerous dichotomy, because what it does is it sets up people to have to choose when there's absolutely no reason to choose between them, when you can choose them both. They both and. Elder Scott, General Conference, October 2007, says there's two ways of discovering the truth, science and revelation. I believe that. I think that's exactly right. And so I want to talk about science. I want to talk about what science is, because we often think of science as this big monolithic thing that makes perfect, that's all in unison. You can hear people talk about scientific conspiracies. I'm disappointed if there is one, because I've never been invited. Maybe they meet on an island in the Caribbean and plan this year's hoax, and I never get invited, so I'm bitter. But I don't think there are any conspiracies. So what is science? Let me talk about one attribute of science that troubles people, and I don't think it should. Science has a non-negotiable stance of methodological materialism. This means no hidden forces, no influence from God, angels, or demons, no magic, no miracles. Whoa. If you're religious, that sounds bad. I don't think it is. I don't think it's talking about scientists can't be religious or believe in God. It's just that God's not expected to interfere in ways that matter to exploring the regularities and laws of the universe. And if you're LDS, we do believe in laws and regularities, and it's this domain that science does its work. What are the regularities? How do atoms behave? How do ecosystems behave in the presence of natural forces? But the other thing is, you're really familiar with methodological materialists. You probably use one. This is a methodological materialist. When you go to the mechanic, you fully expect them to talk in terms of nuts and bolts and carburetors and fan belts. You don't expect a methodological, you expect a story about the material nature of the car to be told so that they can fix and charge you for it. In fact, if you went to your mechanic and she came to you and said, I've looked your car over and I'm pretty sure you're not paying enough tithing. That's why this thing's breaking down. Get on it. You'd probably say, that might be true, but I think I'm going to find a new mechanic. And you would find a new mechanic. Because we want a methodological materialist as our mechanic. We want them to find the problem. We want them to identify some material cause for its failure. So let me give you a definition of science, and this is kind of surprising. Science is an ethic that promotes a set of best practices that have been shown to explicate the world using a bunch of tools that have worked so far. And this kind of breaks that monolithic idea that science is something sacred and holy down a bit, because it really is, the proof is in the pudding. The worth of science is in that it continues to make progress. And I'm going to talk about why, because it's a wonderful thing. You'll notice this overly honest methods section from Twitter is absolutely wonderful. I encourage you to go look at it. It has hundreds of these things that every scientist will recognize as, We don't run ours very fast either because of this. Science is a quest to discover the nature of reality. It has two main goals: explanation, like the explanation of how life turns into organisms through DNA. That was a tremendous discovery, a wonderful discovery. And it makes predictions. What is the Higgs boson? Some very accurate predictions gave a narrow band where it should be found. And they looked and they looked and they looked. And it didn't show up for a long time. People started to wonder if the standard model of the universe was wrong. But boom, I think it was last year, maybe the year before. I lose track of time. But they found it. There were some specific predictions of where it should be found in terms of atom space. I don't know the technical word, but that's the aim of science. And in fact, this is a prediction from my work in transgenic spreading. It showed something that hadn't been seen before: the rise, I won't explain this much. The black parts in there, the rise of resistance phenomena. But it happened in foci that was rather unexpected and novel. And that's what you want to do in science. You want to do something that makes novel predictions and has finding. So this is the scientific method grade school edition. Now we still talk this way. This is an important part of science, but it's also a bit of a cartoon. So it goes like this: find a falsifiable hypothesis from the hypothesis land, or wherever they come from. Set up an experiment to test the hypothesis. And make sure it's falsifiable, by the way. If it cannot be rejected, keep trying. If rejected, go back to number one and rinse and repeat. I get told that evolution's not really a science because it doesn't use this method. You can't get the history of Earth into a test tube, and so there's some skepticism. But I like to point out that astronomers have a lot of trouble getting galaxies into test tubes too, and they still get to do science. So they still get to call what they do science. It might be a conspiracy for all I know. I don't know. And this kind of method actually I explored fictionally in The Scholar of Moab. The character is a high school dropout who wants to become a scientist. And so he's always looking for things. And he comes home and his wife tells him, home from her cosmetic company, that bumblebees can't fly. Science has proved it. Their wings are too small. So bumblebees can't fly. I've actually heard this. So scientists have proven bumblebees can't fly. And so she tells him the reason they fly is because nobody's told them that they can't. They have faith that they can fly, so they do. That makes sense, right? If you have faith to do it, you can do it. And so he does an experiment where his null hypothesis is that you can cut off enough of their wing that they'll lose their faith in their ability to fly. And he tests it. He removes certain percentages of wings. The result is that bumblebees need about 75 to half of their wing in order to have enough faith to fly. And so here's science and faith together. In the wrong way. So science has a set of values. I said it was an ethic, and one thing about an ethic is that implies a set of values that you're concerned about. And the values of science are things like truth, some correspondence of theory. Scientists believe that there's something down there. There's some reality that we're trying to capture. And we want to find that reality. And so the statements that we make about the world, we want to tie to some physical reality. We want transparency. We want the ability to have others look at our work. We want claims that are universal. If our science works on Earth, we'd expect it would work on Mars. I mean, if it was something that could work on Mars. Growing plants wouldn't work very well, for example. Something that's rational and objective. And we have a set of tools. And this is where I think people mistake science for its tools. Experimentation is a huge tool. And it's used differently in different disciplines. Observation is a tool. And for example, in astronomy and in geology, observation becomes a principal means of discovering the world in a different way than doing these kinds of experiments you can do in a test tube. But it's still science. Modeling and representation, trying to capture the reality with theories, with ideas about how the world works, and then data analysis and interpretation. And then there's a set of activities that constrain science and that make it powerful. And in some ways, these are the things that make science work. These are the things that give us the power of science. A stance of openness to revision and holding results as tentative. Scientists are not supposed to get too married to their ideas because they want to challenge them and test them and make sure that they are as good as they can be. And so we take a stance of openness. We construct theories and we test those theories. One big one, peer review and publication. This doesn't get mentioned very often, but it's huge. In science, people are always looking over your shoulder. If you're a scientist, you learn to hate peer review because you've written a beautiful paper. It's absolutely stunning. There is nothing wrong with it. And you get it back and the peer review has torn it to smithereens, and you have to address these before it can be published. It's a brutal process. But it's what makes science strong. The constant looking over your shoulder is what makes science honest and keeps us on our toes. Are we using the right methods? Have we missed something? Transparency, research programs. If you go to any of the departments of science at Brigham Young University or any university, you'll find a set of people gathered with a set of tools, a set of funding, a set of efforts. And credentialing, getting a PhD to do science properly. Using logic and critical thinking. And one thing I want to mention about this kind of research program, I keep hearing people say that scientists are all biased and they all learn from each other and that it's a biased and possibly a conspiracy. We in our department can't even agree on the nature of the wording of a paragraph. It's a constant battle between scientists, and it's this weird sort of collaboration and fight with others about what the nature of reality looks like. That is part of what makes science strong. And also these are important to scientific discovery. And these are very human activities. And that's the thing to keep in mind. science is a human activity. It's done by humans who are biased, who are weak, who are misinformed, lots and lots of things. And we often give short shrift to things like creativity, training, manuals, hikes in cool mountains, skepticism, attending meetings, this entire list, understanding other fields. All these things play into the ideas of what it means to be a scientist. And it is a very human activity. But it's also a very powerful activity. And the good that you see from science is all around you. It's there every time you go to the hospital. It's there every time you eat harvested crops. All these things have benefited. And the other thing you have to keep in mind about science that marks it as science is it makes progress. Science advances. The science we have today is better than the science it was in 1940, which is better than the science of 1920, which is better than the science of 1850. It gets better and better and better because science is self-correcting and it's always examining itself, and that's why it's better. If you don't believe this, though, next time you go to the hospital, tell them you want the 1930s treatment. And see how committed you are to your science doesn't make progress perspective. Pseudoscience, you can tell it doesn't make progress. There's no established agreement on credentialing and things. And take astrology. There's nobody doing studies on, wow, last year we said Leos were courageous and, the evidence is not compelling. So let's try this year saying that Leos are like full of love, whatever. But the idea is that there isn't this same rigor of examining itself and trying to do better and challenging the places where it fails to do better. So this is my statement. I believe that science is the most powerful method for finding truth about the material world ever invented. And there's lots of evidence that it really was invented. A new book by David Wooten argues that it was invented between 1576 and 1604, or 1704. Tycho Brahe's observation of a nova and Newton's publication of optics, and a lot of the things we see like peer review and these other things that I mentioned were invented at that time. So it really is an invention. And I think it's a fairly good one. But when I say that to people, they'll often say, oh yeah, I love science too, but... And in that but are the suspicions they have of science. There's this sort of hold back and don't trust it too much. It'll lead you astray. I'll be controversial and say, I really don't believe that. Science looks at itself enough. The proper amount of skepticism is had by scientists themselves. As I mentioned, they're an ornery lot. And they are skeptical of other people's findings that don't meet theirs, and it is this battle. And I don't think having extra skepticism about science is warranted, because science isn't something that's holy or sacred. It's something that always is challenged. And so when we say that, but often what we want to bring in is a sense of taint, a sense that there's something wrong with holding to science too closely. And we find that some of that's coming from this crowd, because we have these evangelical atheists who don't embrace science, from my perspective, but a kind of scientism. And the difference between science and scientism is that in scientism, you believe that science will eventually lead to all knowledge and that there is nothing else that will ever be found. They tend to be materialists, but that's not a problem for Mormons generally. We're a bunch of materialists too. Even our spirits have material. It's of a finer nature though. So that's not the aspect. But let me challenge scientism, this idea. I do challenge it formally in a paper that was published in the Journal of Science Religion. It was selected for one of the best science religion papers published in the last 100 years. In fact, it's right next to Dawkins' paper. Challenging religion. I put this up so you can order it. It's on sale for $59 left. Let me encourage you to maybe use this as a stocking stuffer for Christmas. It'd make a great gift. Truth is, I don't even own one because, my yearly salary would probably fit that. But why do I argue scientism is wrong? It assumes that all questions can be answered by science. I'm suspicious of that. We're limited beings. If evolution's right, we are a kind of ape. A kind of ape that's very special in that it has a spirit that's a child of God, but nonetheless, a kind of ape. Apes are limited. Chimpanzees will never learn calculus. Quite likely there are things that we will never learn either. As another suspicious, in formal logical systems, there's this theorem called Gödel's theorem, where he realized there are true mathematical theorems that can't be reached from inside the system. There's nothing stronger than logic as far as rigor of relationships goes. And if in logic itself there are truths that can't be reached from the system, why not in something as simple or as messy and likely as in reality? Deeper, there's some aspects of the universe that we may not reach. This is a less tentative suspicion. As soon as somebody figures out what dark matter is, I'll strike that out. I don't think it's spirit matter, by the way. Other universes, there are some things that we're limited in terms of access. These might not be permanent limits, though, so I'll acknowledge that. And there's some in-principle unanswerable questions, like randomness and emergence. This is an area that I've just completed a book about where I explore these in detail, and I'll leave it for that because it'd take me too long. But I want to look at consciousness because it's really interesting. Consciousness is that feeling of what it's like to be something. Right now, you're having a conscious experience of me talking. You see this picture of Mary, the future neurobiologist. You won't be experiencing this when you're asleep. It's that consciousness. So Frank Jackson, a philosopher, came up with this thought experiment to show that there are some in-principle ideas that are not available to science. And he does it this way. Imagine Mary, the neurobiologist from the future, and she understands everything there is to know about seeing the color red. She knows absolutely everything. From the time light waves enters her retina to the time it's processed by the visual cortex and everything that happens in between. By stipulation, there is nothing she does not know about seeing the color red. But here's the caveat, is she sees the world in black and white because of a defect. So the question you need, if you believe that science can answer everything, the question you need to answer when they fix that defect, and for the first time she sees red while winning the neurobiologist Emmys that year, which is to be, of course, a thing of the future, does she learn anything new? And it seems like it would be a hard argument that even though she knew all the scientific facts about seeing the color red, that she didn't learn anything by actually experiencing. There's something fundamental in experience that's not available to science as we understand it. So I do believe science is the most powerful method for finding truth about the material world ever invented. I stand by that. I don't add a but to the end. I think science will take care of the buts. And I'm completely smitten with it. So let's talk about evolution very quickly, because I want to convince you just in 5 minutes that evolution is science at work. It's a crown jewel of science. It's one of the best sciences I know. Started with Darwin, of course. This is a printout from the Journal of Evolution, this month's edition. And this is an active and dynamic research organization. These are some of the papers we see. Trends in the Sand, Directional Evolution, the Shell Shape of Recessing Scallops. Do saline tacks evolve faster? Light enough to travel and wise enough to stay? Brain size evolution and migratory behavior in birds. Evolution is a dynamic and active and thrilling science. And I get the feeling sometimes that the anti-science people picture scientists kind of sitting around the armchair toasting Darwin and holding monkey skulls, which isn't far from the truth for me. But DNA has explicated the nature of life itself. We can read the history of life right from DNA. How things are related, when they diverged. We see it in embryology. We see it within our own embryological history. the similarities between humans and mouse, indicating that there are similar processes between these two groups. We see it in the way that geology has laid down the world. We see it in the evolution story. It's found in the bones, in the fossils. And in fact, we have really just recently, I was so excited by this, so I just thought I'd tell this one. This is a story of where whales came from. They were related to hippos by this underwater swimming thing that's related to beavers or flying squirrels. I can't remember which. It doesn't look like either, but that's evolution. But whales evolved, and we have the entire sequence here. We have the entire sequence of whales from this early thing that kind of looks like a funny dog workhorse. All the things that you see there are fossils that we have. We can see this in the DNA. We can see it in the fossils. We see it in every discipline we look at. Humans are where we see some of the best evidence for evolution. This is a skull sequence of hominids and hominins. Hominins are those that are on our direct line. But we have this. My mentor, Dwayne Jeffries, always asks, show me the missing link here. There's always a missing link. You can find a gap everywhere, but they get smaller and smaller as every year goes by. Darwin said there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. This is a Homo erectus forensic reconstruction. This was constructed in the same ways that they do a crime scene, where they find a skeleton and they want to see what the person looked like. This is a pretty accurate portrayal of what these creatures looked like. We don't know their skin color, the nature of their hair, but as far as their bones and the facial features go, this was real. This was one of our ancestors. That might be my grandfather. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the nature of time. A lot of people think that if God isn't involved in every step, if he's not creating these, and there's a great Far Side cartoon that shows God with clay, and he's rolling up and he goes, "These snakes are a breeze." I love that, but some people are suspicious of science and think that God had to make every little thing. Let me ask you, which program is greater? This one who can program every single game ever created, or a programmer who can write a program that she types the word go and all video games appear? I think you give it to this second one. And that for me is why God is not diminished if he's created a universe whereby things proceed along from the beginning to the end. And this universe actually looks like it's made for this. One thing you'd guess that if you wanted to wait until intelligent life appeared, you need a really big universe with lots of stuff going on, doing little experiments. That's exactly what we see. Catholic theologian John Hott says, after Darwin, theology cannot possibly be the same as before, any more than it could after Galileo. And this is why I'm not bothered by scriptural literalists who read the scriptures and then try to read a scientific story from them. I don't think that's what they were made for. These commandments were given unto my servants in their weakness after the manner of their language. Every age, I believe, has to interpret the scriptures anew for their time and place. One aspect of scripture that intrigues me more than any other is that they are timeless. The Hebrew scriptures were relevant as scriptures to a Bronze Age Hebrew people, to the Jews of the 14th century, to Catholics of the Philippines in the late 1800s, and to Mormons of the Intermountain West today. When God gives a revelation, this timelessness is one of its hallmarks. John Walton's an evangelical person who argues against literal readings of the Bible. He's a Hebrew scholar. And he says, we must keep in mind that we are presumptuous if we consider our interpretations of Scripture to have the same authority as Scripture itself. Nobody is an infallible interpreter, and we must always stand ready to reconsider our interpretations in light of new information. And I'd add new science. We must not let our interpretations stand in the place of Scripture's authority and thus risk misrepresenting God's revelation. We are willing to bind reason if our faith calls for belief where reason fails, but we are also people who in faith seek learning. What we learn may cause us to reconsider interpretations of Scripture, but there is never cause for us to question the intrinsic authority or nature of Scripture. And I think this represents why I think literal readings actually cheapen the use of Scriptures. So, in closing, I may not have convinced you that evolution is real. I didn't present all the evidence. I want to encourage you to go read about it. Get the best books on evolution. Pore over them. Come to understand what the arguments really are. And you'll notice, even if they're written by atheists, if you don't have to follow them into being an atheist. You can be a believing Mormon. You can be a believer of any kind. In Cromwell's letter to the Synod of the Church of Scotland in 1650, he said, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible that you may be mistaken. If you are about to tell the youth of the church that evolution is of the devil, you're setting them up for a dichotomy that's unnecessary and dangerous." And I hope you don't. Because losing the benefits of the church is a terrible, terrible thing to lay on your interpretation on the Scriptures. This is my daughter going into the MTC. She actually leaves for Berlin Monday. This is recent. And I hate to think what life would be like without the gospel there to help and guide her, and for her to have abandoned it for her sense that evolution or some other thing was incompatible. Too often we take our black and white thinking and we do the kind of child's version of hypothesis testing, and we find a single anomaly and get rid of it. We don't do that in science. If we find an anomaly, we start to check our instruments. We make sure that they're working right. We start to check the way we thought about things, because if something should have worked and it doesn't, we need to understand why. It might not be that the hypothesis needed rejecting. It means we maybe needed to do more refinement and more nuance and really try to see what's going on. So I'd be slow. Thank you for being here today. I'll take a few minutes of questions, but thank you.